The calculators all have a feature that lets you enter a number as dollars and cents without having to enter the decimal point. To set this, on some of them, like here on the Sharp, you move this little switch over to the A position over there. On others, the Canon has, let's see, has a plus position over on that switch. The Casio has an add to position over on a switch there. The rest of them all use variations of those, usually either a plus or an A. Let me give you a demonstration here. So for example, if we want to add up $1.22, you can just say 122 add, and you'll get 1.22. And if you add $2.50 to that, you can say you can say 250 add, and it will add $2.50 to it. You can always override that by using a decimal point. If you put a decimal point in the number, it will add wherever you put that. So if I do 125.3 and add that, it will actually add 125.3 to the result. The only other oddity in what gets added comes, of course, on the Monroe. There's a setting where you can say how many digits to the right of the decimal place it will add. All of the others will default to adding 2. With the Monroe, you can actually set it to do 3 or 4 or whatever your heart desires. The real difference between the various models comes with multiplication and division. Now, if you think about it, if you have $1.25, it makes no sense to multiply that by $2.72. What's a currency times a currency? Doesn't make any sense. So they take two different approaches on this. Many of them, like the Sharp, will simply ignore the price setting if you enter a multiplication. So if I do 123 times 2 equals, instead of assuming that either of those numbers is in add mode or price mode, it assumes that those numbers should be taken at face value. If you do multiplication on the Victor in price mode, it assumes that what you're really doing is multiplying a quantity times a price. So for example, if you have 10 items that sell for $3.22, you do 10 times 322 equals, and it assumes that what you meant was 10 times $3.22 equals $32.20. So in other words, with multiplication, the first number that you enter is going to be taken at face value. The second number will move the decimal point over. That's for multiplication. For division, it's the opposite, which again kind of makes sense. If you have a total of $5.25 for a dozen wombats, and you divide that by 12 and press equals, we find that each of our wombats costs 44 cents. It took the $5.25 to be a price value, 12 to be the units, and 44 cents is the result. Both Victors work the same way, where multiplication in price mode will do, the first number is taken as a unit, the second number is taken as a price when you multiply, and for division, the first number is taken as a price, and the second one is taken as a number of units. As with many other things, the Monroe does things differently. The default is like most of the others, where it just uses unit if you do multiplication or division, but you can have different settings to define whether it should do price times units, or price times price, which makes no sense, or units times price. There are define modes for each of those, and by define modes I mean you press define, and a value, and it sets it to that configuration. The calculators all have a grand total feature, which I'll demonstrate with the Victor PL8000. To enable it, there's usually a switch. You set the switch on this one to the GT setting. I don't know if you can see it, but there it is. Okay, the best way to describe this is with an example. Let's add 1 and 2 and 3 and grab the total, and the total is 6. Now, remember when I press the total key here, it recalls and clears the accumulator. So if I grab the total again, it's 0. Let's now add 4 and 5 and 6, and adding those up you get 15. Now if I press the grand total, it's going to remember the values from all of these calculations added together, and we get 21. So let me advance that a little bit, and you'll see we added 1, 2, and 3 to get 6. We then added 4, 5, and 6 to get 15, and 15 plus 6 is the grand total of 21. They all do this. Now where it differs is in some of the details. Is it always computed or only computed when the switch is set? Does every plus and minus add to the grand total, or only when you actually grab the total from the accumulator with the star or the diamond key? Does the grand total have its own item count? And if so, what is the item count? Is it the number of times that the star or diamond key has been pressed, or the number of additions that you've used to put into the accumulator? Is there an indicator to show when you have a grand total? I'll give you an example, the Monroe over here. Let's set that up to GT mode here. 25, add. Notice the light here came on. This light indicates there's a value in the grand total. This light indicates there's a value in the accumulator. If we press the star key, the accumulator light goes off because, as with all of them, when you grab the total out of the accumulator, it zeroes it out. But the grand total still has a value within it. Other things, is the grand total stored in one of the memory registers? On some of these, the grand total basically takes over one of the independent memory registers. And do the independent memory registers have their own grand total? So all of these are different things that they all can do differently. All of the calculators have an item count feature. This means that it will count the number of items that you have added to the accumulator. Other than supporting it, this is perhaps the feature where they have the most differences. For example, when you press subtract, does it add the item or subtract it? Add to the item count or subtract it? So over here on the Monroe, let's do 1, 2, 3, add, and then 4, 5, 6, add. And then if we take the total, and I'll feed that a little bit, if you can see there, it has the total and 2 written in red over here on the left that shows that you added 2 numbers together. Now comes the fun part. Let's subtract something. If we subtract 56 and take a look at the accumulator again, this one has 3. So we have basically done 3 operations on the accumulator. On others, such as down here on the sharp, let's set this. The switch is over here to set it to item count. I'll do it clear. Let's do 1, 2, 3, add. 4, 5, 6, add. We'll take a look at what we have there. And if you can see, it has set 2. It's got 2 on the on what it's printed for the item count. If we then subtract 45, subtract, and put that out again, you'll see that it now has 1 on it, on the item count. So the sharp will subtract 1 from the item count when you subtract and add when you add. Personally, I like the way the Monroe does it. It's better to know how many operations you've done than whether you've done addition or subtraction. There are some other subtle things. Do the accumulator and the grand total and the memory registers all have separate item counts, or is all that just a single thing? Let's go back on the sharp again and see what it does. I'll show you what I mean here. If I now do 1, 2, 3, M plus, 4, 5, 6, M plus, and then let's do 78, M minus, and take a look at the total. It has 1 written there. And that presumably means that it did, right, so it did the same with the memory as it did with the accumulator. It did 2 additions and a subtraction and came up with 1. The Monroe also has separate item counts for both grand total and for the individual memories. The grand total on the Monroe gets incremented every time you do an addition or a subtraction. On some of the others, the grand total gets added to only when you press the star key or get the total from the accumulator. Other changes, can you set the item count directly? On some of these, there's a way to set the item count, or at least increment or decrement it by whatever number you want to input. Is the item count actually displayed, or can you only print it? There aren't many that will display it, but the Casio is one of them. I've got 4 items in the accumulator right now. I've got that set to do item counting. And another question is whether that item count is always computed, or whether it's only done when you have the switch set to do it. Again, the Monroe is always adding to it, I know that. The others I don't recall at the moment.